And if that's the case, what happens to the Chinese market? What happens to manufacturing? What happens to supply chains? Do we see an even more pullback for tech especially? And if tech gets a pullback, NASDAQ carries the market, that could bring the market down. Evergrande is a property behemoth, as it were, right? So it's the largest real estate, private, I guess you could call it, real estate company in China. Now, I'm going to talk about this as China. I want you to imagine the United States. Now, it's not, and there's a lot of things here, but I'm just going to break down what's going on because a lot of people keep hearing Evergrande, and they don't understand what's going on. You either hear one pundit say, oh, well, if they default, then the whole global economy is going to collapse. And other people saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter because it's just get washed out. Both are right and both are wrong. There's a lot of intricacies, and we're seeing how it plays out. So, Evergrande, what is the problem here? Let's break it down from the beginning. It is a real estate company. You ever seen all those giant buildings in China, those huge skyscrapers that are just little mini apartments that are just all the way up, right? Cramped housing in the cities and areas. They are the ones behind building that. The problem is that because they are affordable housing, they're not necessarily a profitable endeavor. And what do you do when you are in a massive spending spree and a massive building spree? You take on debt. Well, Evergrande is by definition has been running as a Ponzi scheme, right? They are acquiring debt, whether it's private, whether it's public, whether it's venture capital, however you want to look at it, they're acquiring it. And in order to pay back investors, they were basically doing a Ponzi scheme. They were taking money from new investors and paying off other investors. All the meanwhile, rapidly building and going further into debt to build more properties, right? Because there was this whole thing of affordable housing and getting more properties out there and the whole 9 yards, right? So they just kept going and going and going and going and going, all right? Well, it's basically a $300 billion Ponzi scheme. Now, how did this play out and what led to it? So they continued to get further and further in debt, right? Because they're just building and building and building. It costs money. They need to raise money. They're getting these investors to give them money. And then other investors are like, hey, I want my payment. So they paid them with the money from the other people and continue to build and get more people in. Literally how a Ponzi scheme works, okay? Then China came out with the 3 red lines. Now, whether this was an attack on Evergrande or all businesses that were getting too powerful, or you think it was a smart decision by a government to make sure that they don't get out of hand, there are 3 red lines. What were those 3 red lines? A breakdown is basically liabilities to assets must be below 70%. In other words, you cannot have more liabilities than assets. You can have 70% liabilities to asset ratio and no higher, okay? So that means you can't, take on, $300 billion in liabilities and have $5 billion in assets. Now, banks can do that. That's called fractional reserve lending, but that's a whole other conversation. Now, for those of you guys who are already getting ready to type and say, well, Stocky actually blah, 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 blah. Listen, I'm giving a very watered down version for people to kind of have an understanding, or if they're at their next office party and somebody brings it up, they can sound smart, okay? Number 2, debt to equity must be below 100%, okay? Debt to equity must be below 100%. And number 3, your cash to short-term debt must be greater than 100%. In other words, the government basically said, you can't put yourself in massive debt. In some cases, that's smart, but in other cases, that could stagnate growth. But when these 3 lines came in, there was several companies who were failing to meet any of them, but there was one company that was seriously failing. Evergrande, $300 billion they owed. They did not have that in assets. They did not have that in cash. They didn't have any of that, okay? They were massively in debt, and they were basically running a Ponzi scheme. So what happens when a company $300 billion in debt is told by their government, who controls everything, that can't happen anymore? Well, you can't borrow any more money. So if you can't borrow any more money, what happens when all the people that come, just like with Bernie Madoff, right? All the people come to collect their money. You don't have any money. And you can't take on money from new investors because of the 3 red lines. So then you get exposed. Their stock is currently trading down 90% because obviously nobody wants to own a company who is $300 billion in debt and is getting called to action. So now that we know that, let's go back in time a year and see where the warning signs were. Fitch rating system is basically one of the large companies that does what's called, kind of like we have credit rating systems for governments. These guys basically rate the default possibilities and the credit rating of these individual companies. September of last year, Fitch lowered them to a B+. June of this year, down to a B. July of this year to a CCC+. September to a CC. 9/21, again, September of this year to a C. And as of this month, they are in a restricted default status. That means that they're not technically defaulted yet, because you can't default unless you pay some and don't pay some. If you just don't pay anybody, you can't really technically default yet, right? You can, but you're not really gonna default because it's a longer process than that. So they put them in a restricted default status, okay? So how does this affect the bigger economy? Well, how did they get here? They had a $83 million bond repayment that they had to make. They couldn't make it. What ends up happening is that puts you into default. They gave them a 30-day grace period. They couldn't do it. They couldn't make the payments. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, Stocky, why haven't they completely collapsed yet? Well, remember, there's several things in play here. Number one, there's different types of investors. Number two, they're selling off half-built buildings, giving those away as repayments. They're trying to do everything they can, but they're still missing payments. And now there's a backlog of these bond repayments that they have to make that they can't afford. So let's bring this down a little bit more. Let's bring it down a little bit more in the micro side. There's a big difference between bonds that are held from people within a country and offshore bonds, right? So people that are citizens of the country that invested and people that are offshore that invested, okay? The issue becomes, for most companies, there are laws in place that if you have to pay back your investors, you have to pay them equally, right? So you can't pick and choose who you pay back, how much you pay back, and when. It's supposed to be default protection across the board. But what they're doing is they're not doing cross default protection. The CCP, the government, is actually telling them to pay the Chinese citizens first, right? Because it's different kind of control. How are they going to do this? Well, they're already telling them, hey, you need to take out loans against your assets, not the business assets, but personal assets, right? The CEO is worth billions of dollars. The government's saying, hey, sell your mansion, sell your jets. They sold a Learjet to pay a couple people off, but there's still citizens lining up for this. So what does this mean? It's not so much what's happening in their country. It's the $19 billion in offshore bonds. And if they can't pay their local bonds and their national bonds, there's no way they're going to get to their offshore bonds. Now, technically speaking, everyone's supposed to have the same entitlement to payment, offshore or localized. But that's not happening. So people are saying, how does this affect the global economy? Now, I personally don't think Evergrande is going to take down the global economy, because I look at something like BlackRock, who has like $3 trillion in assets, and I feel like it's not going to. I think it's going to have a little bit of reverberating effect in the Chinese economy, but it's not going to lead to a downfall. However, it could spark what's called a domino effect in the global economy, and that's where I'm going to move to next. Okay, because of Evergrande, it's caused a domino effect within other large real estate inside of China, right? We have repayments that have been now missed by Fantasia, Cynic, and Kaisa. These are the other three giant property companies in China right now. And these guys are all missing payments as well. Now that we know that other large real estate companies and large property management and building companies are losing money. What is that going to cause? It's going to cause a few things. Number one, will the CCP come in and say, see, this is why capitalism doesn't work? They're going to say our 3 red lines were not what did this. These companies put themselves, we're protecting the consumer and everything like that. However, and this is what I'm focusing on, is the microeconomics of this. So many, because one thing the CCP allows municipal governments, city governments, towns, and municipal governments to make investments on behalf of citizens. And so many municipal governments invested in Evergrande and some of these other ones. So if they do default and there isn't a way to pay back, it's not just individual investors that could get wrecked. It could be local governments, hundreds and hundreds of them. And in so many of these local municipal governments, you have manufacturing. And if those governments go defunct or they get defaulted via the Evergrande if default, that could lead to that larger butterfly effect. I'm not even talking about the bond repayments for rich investors or poor people. I'm not talking about individual investors. I'm talking about municipal governments. That's what my concern is how many municipal governments are tied up because they allow municipal governments to invest in companies. So if they default and that falls on a municipal, that has a reverberation effect that could go through supply chains and cause another problem. As far as money being lost by investors that are overseas bond repayments, we're not talking the same numbers of like when Lehman Brothers happened in 2008. We're not talking about, $5-6 trillion in a bubble asset, in the United States. We're talking about offshore bonds and investing $19 billion. That is offshore, but it's the in-state. That's the problem. Now, what does the government do? Does the government just take them over? Forgive the debt? They really can't, because a lot of this stuff is, like I said, from municipal. So what do? Are they going to supplement the municipals to keep it going? I don't think this is going to cause a global, meltdown for property and real estate. But I think localized in Asia, if this isn't somehow negated or, the impact is lessened or softened, this could have a down to up trigger effect in China. And if that's the case, what happens to the Chinese market? What happens to manufacturing? What happens to supply chains? Do we see even more constraints? Do we see an even more pullback for tech especially? And if tech gets a pullback, NASDAQ carries the market, that could bring the market down. So that's what I'm watching with Evergrande, okay? But I didn't really want to give you guys a forecast. So that was just my little TLDR of what's going on. There's so much more, but I was trying to water it down. That was a long TLDR.